They say that a lot of quality ministry sometimes comes out of a crisis that somebody's been through. And that was my case. Years ago, after graduating from Bible school, I went back to the same job that I had before going to Bible school. That can be a real downer, if you know what I mean. Well, went to work. We had our first child and lived in the state of Minnesota. Went to work in our church and was in church every time we possibly could be. And once a year, our church would make mission trips. We would go to Central America, South America, the West Indian Islands, if you're familiar with that area. I'd take my vacation time and we'd spend it on mission trips. And these trips were so awesome because on these trips we got to be, in my thinking, spiritual all the time. Before that, you know, you're spending 40 to 50 hours a week working, you're spending just a few hours in church. And I just had the thinking that, God, this is such a waste of time. All I want to do is serve you, and I'm spending all this time working a job to pay the bills. So we're on this mission trip, and we had large crusades. We would have outdoor crusades. I was in charge of children's ministry. There were more children that came to these crusades than total people that were in our church back in Minnesota. Just had a great time. And I remember after one particular trip coming back home, and I was driving into my job, about a half-hour drive, about halfway to work, and I'm just thinking about going back to work again for the first time after the trip. And it was so disheartening that I did not want to go, because in my mind, as soon as I walked through that door of my job, I was no longer spiritual. I was just doing whatever everybody does, Christian or non-Christian. And I pulled the car over on the side of the road, and I prayed a prayer, and I wasn't crying on the outside. Men typically don't do that, but I was sure crying on the inside. And I said, God, you've got to change my life. You've got to change my job so I can serve you. And it was like, Lord, if you don't do that, I don't know if life is worth continuing to live, because, heaven's a lot better than just work all the time. So I got back on the road and walked into work, and the Lord did something in the next weeks and months with me. He is wise. He did not answer my prayer the way I wanted him to. I'm glad about that. He did not begin to change my job, but he began to change me. I had grown up in church and gone to church my whole life. As far as I can remember, I never heard a sermon about work. I'd never read a book about work. I've never heard anybody really make a connection between work and Christianity. Now, maybe they preached those sermons and I didn't listen. It's possible. But I didn't remember them. And I began a study. This was back in the mid-90s or so, early to mid-90s. I began a study about what the Bible had to say about work. And there were very few books at that time, very few resources, and I just began to go through verse by verse in the Bible, eventually came across some other good resources, and it's been a study of mine for 20 years, and my absolute passion is to help people to change their life by changing their workplace experience. I like the story of a man named Brother Lawrence. He was a monk in the 17th century. And he lived a very simple life. He worked in the kitchen washing pots and pans. And he walked so close to Jesus that people came from great distances just to be with him, to be in his presence. He made this statement. He wrote a book called Practicing the Presence of, I think it's either Practicing the Presence of Jesus or Practicing the Presence of God. Here's a statement that Brother Lawrence made. He said, "In the noise and clatter of my kitchen, while several people are at the same time calling for different things, I possess God in as great peace as if I were on my knees praying." Can you imagine that? Brother Lawrence said, I possess God in as great peace while I'm in the kitchen among all the noise and clatter as if I were on my knees praying. In our first session today, we looked at Adam and how God gave him a job before sin entered the world. Work is not a curse. Work exists today. Work will exist forever. But now we're going to go scripturally. There's about 500 verses in the Bible about work. The good news is we're not going to look at all 500 of them. But we are going to look at a few key selected ones, particularly ones that have to do with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Because God, throughout Scripture, will call himself the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So we'll begin with Abraham. The Bible tells us we're to walk in the steps of our faith, of our father Abraham. Let's look at Genesis chapter 21 and verse 22. Genesis chapter 21 and verse 22. At that time, Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his forces, said to Abraham, God is with you in everything that you do. Abimelech was the king of the area. Back then, kings didn't have necessarily large areas. They had more like small regions that they were ruling over. And Abimelech was the king. Phicol was the commanding officer of his forces. As far as we know, they weren't believers. Get this in your thinking. The most powerful man in the region and his commanding officer come to Abraham. They had not gone to church with Abraham, as far as we know. They'd seen Abraham in his life. What was Abraham? Abraham, although he was a prophet, how did he spend his life day to day? He was a rancher. He dealt in real estate. He was a farmer. He was not a preacher. He was not an evangelist, as we would define those terms today. But he was a very successful business person. And the king of the area, the most powerful man in the area, comes to him and says, Abraham, please, I've noticed something. God is with you in everything that you do. Please promise me that you won't hurt me. Can you imagine the blessing that Abraham walked in? So much so that the king of the area said, Abraham, whether you're a rancher, whether you're a farmer, whether you're dealing in real estate, whatever you're doing, God is with you in everything that you do. Friend, does the world say that to us Christians today? Or do they look at us and they go, he hates his job just like I hate my job? Or, he doesn't handle those problems any better than I handle those problems. That was not the case with Abraham. It said, I read a book by a Jewish rabbi once, he said it's possible that Abraham had relationships with 20,000 people. 20,000 different people that he knew, that he dealt with in business, that he dealt with in daily life. And probably most of them said, as Abimelech said, Abraham, God is with you in everything that you do. Now let's look at Isaac, Genesis chapter 26. Genesis chapter 26, and we will start reading at verse 1. There was a famine in the land, besides the previous famine in Abraham's time, and Isaac went to Abimelech, the king of the Philistines, in Gerar. That would be modern-day Gaza, by the way. The Lord appeared to Isaac and said, do not go down to Egypt. Live in the land where I tell you. Stay in this land for a while. I'll be with you, and I will bless you. For to you and your descendants I give all these lands, and will confirm the oath I swore to your father Abraham. Go down to verse 12, please. Isaac planted crops in that land. Again, Isaac worked a job. He was a farmer. He planted crops in that land, and the same year reaped 100-fold because the Lord blessed him. Everybody else is experiencing famine. But verse 13 says, the man became rich, and his wealth continued to grow until he became very wealthy. He had so many flocks and herds and servants that the Philistines envied him. How often does the world envy us today because we're so blessed? One possible suggestion that I've heard for Isaac here is that the Lord showed him an irrigation system. And in building this irrigation system, even though there was a famine, he was able to have wonderful, bountiful crops in that land. Don't know if it was an irrigation system or what, but it was something that caused Isaac as a worker to be blessed even when there was a famine. Now let's look at the story of Jacob. Jacob's story is absolutely amazing, and we won't read all of it, but there's one particular verse I want to draw your attention to. It's Genesis chapter 30 and verse 27. Genesis chapter 30 and verse 27. Jacob is working for a boss who is an idol worshiper. He's not a Christian. His name is Laban. And Jacob has been working for Laban for quite some time, and it's been very difficult. Jacob says this, "I've worked with all my strength." 10 times Laban cheated him. You ever been cheated at your job? 10 times Laban cheated him and changed his wages from one amount to another. And Jacob reaches a point where he's just about had enough. He's worked for him for, I think, 14 years at this time. He goes to Laban and he's about to resign. He's about to give his notice. Now listen to what Laban says to Jacob in verse 27. But Laban said to him, "If I have found favor in your eyes, please stay. I've learned by experience." Now some translations say divination, but that's actually translated experience. "I've learned by experience that the Lord has blessed me because of you." Here is an idol-worshiping boss. Jacob is about to leave because he wants to go back to his homeland and continue on his life. He's tired of being cheated. He's tired of working for Laban. And Laban basically grabs him and says, "Laban, don't leave. You must stay because I've learned from experience that the Lord has blessed me because of you." Is that what the world says about you at your job? Is that what your boss says? Is that what your company says? That the Lord has blessed your boss, the Lord has blessed your company because of you and what you bring to it. So we won't read the rest of this story, but Jacob decides to stay. And Laban says, "You can have anything that you want." And Jacob says, "Well, all I want is the speckled and the spotted animals." And Laban says, "Sure." And you know what Laban does? He goes through all the flocks that day and he takes out all the speckled and spotted animals so Jacob doesn't have any. So once again, he's still being cheated by Laban. But Jacob has a dream, and in this dream, he sees himself taking a branch and putting stripes around it, peeling parts of the bark off it. And he takes this and he puts it in front of the animals when they come to mate and when they come to drink water and mate. And all of a sudden he starts to have animals that are speckled and spotted. And he once again ends up being extremely blessed. I want to share a little bit about by the way, this one more tidbit about Jacob. When he first went to work for Laban, he was working for Rachel. And he worked 7 years for her. You know the story. And it's Genesis chapter 29, verse 20. I think it's so awesome. It says he worked for, well, let's just go ahead and read it here. Genesis chapter 29 and verse 20. "Jacob served 7 years to get Rachel." But again, he didn't get Rachel. He got Leah. That's one more time when Laban cheated him. But look at what it says here. "But those 7 years seemed like only a few days because of his love for her." That's almost a miracle. Working 7 years, but your 7 years only seeming like a few days? I don't know if you've ever had this experience, but it's Tuesday morning, and you go to work, and it's 9 o'clock in the morning, and pretty soon you think it's got to be noon because it seems like you've been there forever. And you look at your watch, and you've been there for 50 minutes. And the time, when is it going to be lunchtime? When is this day going to be over? One time I was on an elevator in a hospital visiting someone, and these two nurses got on the elevator, and it obviously had been a very busy, a very stressful day for them. My wife is a nurse, and health profession can be very stressful. Friend, any profession can be very stressful. All jobs have problems. So we're not talking about finding work that is problem-free. We're talking about taking whatever job we have and bringing the blessing of the Lord to that job. Well, these two nurses got on the elevator, and they're talking to each other, and this one nurse says, it's Tuesday afternoon. She says, I know it's only Tuesday, but it sure seems like Friday. It's got to be Friday. I sure wish it was Friday, because today has been Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday all put together in one day. So anyway, I want to talk about our Jewish roots regarding work, because there's something we can learn. I mean, the Jewish people are the, God's covenant people in the flesh, and we as believers, we're God's covenant people spiritually, so we can learn from each other. When they were in Egypt, they were under Pharaoh's oppression. They hated going to work. They just absolutely hated it because they had a horrible boss. But all of a sudden, God delivers them. And a man named Miles Monroe wrote a wonderful book that I would suggest you reading sometime if you get a chance. It's called The Burden of Freedom. The Burden of Freedom. And he talks about the fact that it's more difficult to be free than it is to be a slave. Because when you're a slave, you do what you do when someone tells you to do it. But when you're free, you have to do self-initiated work. And he talks about it, how difficult it was for them to wake up at 4:30 in the morning to milk the cows in the Promised Land. So anyway, just a thought there. Jewish people today, there is a Jewish root word for work that is the same root word for worship. There is a Greek root word for work that is the same root word for sorrow. Now that has some very significant implications for us. To the Jewish mindset, to work is the same as to worship. To a Greek mindset, or I would add the mindset of this world, to work is to sorrow. And remember, we talked about that in the first session, that Aristotle said that work was a curse and work was a punishment from the gods. Why do Jewish people prosper so much at work? Think about this. There's some different answers you could give to that question of why Jewish people prosper so much. Some people say there's a Jewish conspiracy to take over the world. I had someone who understands Jewish people tell me this. They said if you put 12 Jewish people in a room, you're going to have 15 opinions. They always have different opinions, and they disagree quite readily with one another. There's not a Jewish conspiracy to take over the world, but some people think there is. Some people think 9/11 and the terror attacks on the Twin Towers, that was created by Jewish people to cause all sorts of problems. I don't believe that, obviously. That's ridiculous. Other people say this, in answer to the question, why do Jewish people prosper? Well, God put some special financial DNA in their genes. No, we're all created in the image of God. While we may be different nationalities and have different DNA, there is no such thing as financial DNA. Here's why Jewish people prosper. I believe this is the primary reason. They have a moral enthusiasm for work. A moral enthusiasm for work. They believe with all their heart that work is good, it's moral, and it's right. Now, it can be misused, just like physical sexual relationships are good. The Bible says they're good between a husband and a wife, but that can be abused. Work can be abused. You can work too much, work too little. You can be a boss who takes advantage of people. You can be an employee who's dishonest and all that. But basically, the concept of work, it's good, it's moral, and it's godly, and they can't wait to do it. We can't wait for the weekend. They can't wait to go to work. I had a woman in Ukraine say, Nate, I used to work for a Jewish family, and what you're talking about is exactly true. She said on Thursday night, She would hear, Thursday night, Friday's the next day. She would hear the family talking, and they'd say something like this. Wow, tomorrow's Friday. We only got one more day to go to work this week. This week went so fast. What happened to it, And they're just like regretting the fact that there's only one more day to work that week. Whereas on the weekend, she'd hear statements like this from this Jewish family. They were, I don't know what kind of business. They were business people. I don't know what kind. They would say on Saturday night, after tomorrow, we get to go back to work again. Another new week, new opportunities, new potential. I can't wait for it to happen. Essentially just the opposite of what people in the world and what a lot of Christians say about work. What do we say? We can't wait for the weekend. And as we said earlier, you come Sunday, you got people that can't even enjoy their day off on Sunday because they're thinking, the next day I have to go back to work again. But the Jewish people, to put it in perspective, because we're not talking about working all the time, we're just talking about seeing work, normal work, 8 hours or so a day, 5-6 days a week, as being a blessing from God. What the Jewish people do on Shabbat then, which is Friday evening, right? Shabbat is Friday evening. They gather around the table and they basically forget about their jobs. Some of us aren't very good at that. We think about our jobs all the time, They forget about their jobs. They just focus on the family. And that's when the husband turns to Proverbs 31, I believe it is, the chapter on the virtuous woman. And he reads that chapter of the Bible. And then he looks at the children and he says, "Children, this is your mother." Isn't that awesome? So they have it in perspective. But on the other hand, their lives are not hindered by regretting what they do when they go to work every day. They enjoy it. Hence, 22% of all Nobel Peace Prize winners have been Jewish people. 22%, almost 1/4. Even though they are 0.02% of the world's population. Here's some quotes by some very significant people that you're going to recognize concerning Israel. First of all, Warren Buffett. Warren Buffett says this: Israel is the leading, largest, and most promising investment hub outside of the United States. Bill Gates from Microsoft has said this: the innovation going on in Israel is critical to the future of the technology business. You appreciate your cell phone? It's going to be even smarter and better years down the road, partly because of Israeli creativity. Israel created a drip irrigation system. Remember we talked about Isaac and how he possibly created an irrigation system? Israel did, we know, definitely create a drip irrigation system that caused 240 million trees to bloom in the desert. And I think that's a fulfillment of Isaiah 35:1, where it says the desert shall blossom as a garden or something to that effect. In New York City alone, there are about 200 Israeli startup businesses just in the city of New York City. Throughout the centuries, I found this traveling and ministering in Eastern Europe. Here's what would happen to the Jewish people after they were dispersed. Of course, Jerusalem was destroyed in AD 70, and the Jewish people were dispersed and did not have a homeland for about 2,000 years. They would go to a certain area, and they would have no rights. They were considered the outcast of society, and they would begin to go to work. And they would begin to prosper over the course of time. And the king of that region, again, countries weren't as large back then, the king, the leader of that area, would eventually go to war with somebody. Well, in the process of going to war with someone, he wouldn't have enough money for his country to carry out the war and keep the country's economy going. So he'd come to the Jewish people. They had the money. Why did they have the money? Because as someone told me, they took to heart Genesis chapter 2, verse 12 that says the gold of that land is good. The rest of us, well, is gold good or is it not good? Does God want us to prosper? Does he not want us to prosper? And we have different thoughts on that. They just believe it's good. Business is good. And if you do business right, you will have the blessing of the Lord on your work. So anyway, the king of the area would go to war. He wouldn't have enough funds. So he would borrow from the Jewish people. Well, once the war is over, in order to not have to pay the Jewish people back, what do? You kick them out of the area. You persecute them. You make life difficult for them. So they would go to another area. They'd go to another area and the whole process would start again. They would go to work. They would work really hard. They would become blessed. And eventually the king would go to war. He would borrow money from them. And that happened again and again and again. Well, there's one particular place in southern Poland that this happened, that the king decided he was going to impose a chimney tax on homes. And back at that time, each room in a home would have a separate chimney. So if you had a house with 5 rooms, you would have 5 chimneys, and the king would get a tax on all 5 of those chimneys. Well, some Jewish person created a way so that you could only have 1 chimney. Eliminate the other 4. So how do you think the king felt about that? And once again, more persecution for the Jewish people. However, today, just listen to this, 75% of all big business in Germany is controlled by Jewish people. 75%. What do you think Hitler would think of that? Tried to get rid of the Jews, but they came back, and they came back strong. During the Dark Ages, going through a little bit of history now and basic ideas about work. During the Dark Ages, trading for profit was thought to be immoral. Even today, I read that in Hollywood movies, twice as much, if there's a business person in a movie, twice as much he's considered to be a bad guy instead of a good guy. And you just think of the movies you've seen, and you probably can connect with that thinking. Now, during the Reformation, this was an important time. After 1,000 years of the Dark Ages, people like Martin Luther and John Wesley came along, and Luther made this statement: there are 3 vocations in which you cannot serve God. Number 1 was as a banker. Now, the reason he said that is because there were some bankers that charged very excessive interest rates to people, and he considered that immoral and corrupt, so that's why he said that. Banking as a whole can be very positive, but back at that time, there were bankers who were extremely greedy, charging way too much interest. The second vocation, he said, that you cannot serve God is as a prostitute, and that's obvious. But then he said the third one. What do you think the third one was? As a monk. Imagine how much trouble that got him into. You know why he said you could not serve God as a monk? Because monks separated themselves from society. They went off into convents, and they shut the door behind them in this convent. And they would spend all their time in contemplation. They would spend all their time being spiritual. And they had 0 contact with society. And Luther said, God hasn't called us to be separate from the world. He's called us not to be of the world, but He's called us to be in the world. So Luke said, if you're a monk, you can't really be serving God the way that God intended for you to serve God. And he made this statement: the work of a monk is not superior to the work of a farmer. The call of God comes to each person at their job. Isn't that good? The Reformation, it's all about the just shall live by faith, but it's also about the individual priesthood of each believer. That it wasn't just the monks, it just wasn't just the priests that were called by God. Luther is saying, and the Bible says, everybody's called by God, regardless of their occupation. William Tyndale, another one of the Reformation leaders, said this: outwardly, all of you folks that spend time washing dishes. I've more and more I find it's the husbands, it's the guys in the home that wash the dishes. I know in our house I just enjoy it. I just naturally, after we're done eating, I'll go to the sink and I'll start washing the dishes. Well, William Tyndale says this: outwardly, there's a difference between washing dishes and preaching a sermon. But as far as pleasing God, there is no difference. meaning you can please God as much if you do it with all your heart. If you do it unto the Lord, you can please Him as much washing dishes as you can preaching a sermon. It's called the what we're talking about, folks, is called the Judeo-Christian work ethic. And basically, that brought Europe out of the Dark Ages. And it was amazing. And we've just made some highlights of it today. But I was talking to a friend of mine in Poland once who pastors a very good church. And he says sometimes Catholic people will come to him and they will ask him if they have people in his church who understand the Judeo-Christian work ethic. And he said his answer basically is no. We've gotten so far away from it that even people that go to good Protestant churches no longer have a good understanding of what is called the Judeo-Christian work ethic. Maybe you've heard of Smith Wigglesworth. Smith Wigglesworth was a mighty man of God years ago, I think in England mostly, if not totally. Before he served God as a fivefold ministry gift, evangelist, whatever you want to call him, whatever you say his ministry was, he served God as a plumber. And one day, we were talking in last session about going to work with joy and going to work with peace. Well, one day he was working in the home of this very wealthy lady, and he's laying on the floor, getting dirty. If there's a job where you get dirty, it's a plumber. And he's, got her pipes apart. It's hot. It's sweaty. He's dirty. He's trying to find this plumbing problem, and he's singing a song to himself. The lady walks by, and she looks in, and she hears this voice, and she realizes it's Wigglesworth, and he's singing. Well, she comes back 15 minutes later. He's still on the floor, still sweaty, still dirty. He's still singing. She leaves, comes back a few minutes later, same thing. Finally, her curiosity gets the best of her, and she walks in and she says, "Mister, can you please tell me why you're so happy?" And he wisely gave a very simple answer, and he said, "Yes, because of Jesus." And obviously he was able, if not lead her to the Lord, to be a very significant witness to her that day. I want to give you 3 definitions, and these will help to redefine our understanding of work, to give it a biblical mindset of work. The first definition is for the word work. What is work? Well, if you have the Greek and a Roman mindset or the worldly mindset, work is toil, it's boring, it's irrelevant. No. Here's what work is. Oswald Chambers, the great missionary, gave it this definition. Work is the daily invasion of the believer's influence into the world. The daily invasion of the believer's influence into the world. I like that word invasion. What does an army do when it goes after another country? It invades it. Well, what do Christians do on Monday morning when we don't go to church? We went to church on Sunday, but on Monday morning when we go into the world, we invade the world, not as a physical army, but as a spiritual army. So I'll give it to you again. Work, is the daily invasion of the believer's influence into the world. What is the workplace? Doesn't matter what you call that company. Doesn't matter what name is on it on the outside. The workplace is a community of people who need Jesus. Unless you work with all Christians, you work with a community of people who need Jesus. And even if you work with all Christians, you work with people who need more of Jesus. So either way, it's all about sharing Jesus. Definition number 3. What is the Christian worker? What is the Christian worker? The Christian worker is a full-time servant of Jesus Christ. I wish we had time to talk about what the Bible says about the will of God for people. That's the number one question people want to find out. I've heard other ministers that travel all across America or different places in the world. People always want to know, what is God's will for my life? Well, one of the statements that have stuck with me, you hear some things and you try to remember them and you can't. And you hear other things and even if you tried to forget them, you can't. Well, I heard a statement once. I was listening to a man named Lester Sumrall, great man of God, pastor and missionary, powerful ministry. Years ago, he passed away, I think about 20 years ago. Anyway, he made this statement. I can tell you where I was when I heard it. I can tell you what I was doing when I heard it, and I heard it a long time ago. He said, 98% of all Christians are in the will of God and don't know it, and they're running around like a chicken with its head cut off looking for it. I'll say that again, repeating him. 98% of all Christians are in the will of God and they don't know it, and they're running around like a chicken with their head cut off looking for it. What is the will of God for our life? To serve Him with all our heart at home, at church, and at the workplace. As a full-time, listen, if you work in a factory, you're called full-time. People don't talk about that very often. You're called full-time to serve Jesus in that factory. If you work in church, if you're a pastor, you have a full-time call upon your life to serve the Lord. If you work as a teacher, that's not a part-time calling. The Bible, there's no place that you can open up the Bible and say, well, if you have a certain type of job, you only have a part-time call upon your life. That's not true. We have thought up those ideas because we don't understand that all jobs are spiritual. Every one of us. Repeat this after me. Please say, I have a full-time call to serve Jesus. The only question we ask is where? Pastors have a full-time call to serve the Lord at church. Teachers have a full-time call to serve the Lord at their school. Doctors have a full-time call to serve the Lord at their hospitals. I know this one doctor, he was a surgeon, a very, very renowned surgeon. And he saved a lot of people's lives. Because when he would be doing surgery and he would reach a certain point in a critical operation, I mean, we're talking life or death here. And he knew how he was taught in medical school to do it. But he's thinking, this is different. I've never seen a situation quite like this. And he'll just say a quick prayer and say, Lord, I know the book says to do it this way. But I'm concerned if I do it this way, I'm going to lose this patient. Lord, what do you say? I mean, this is happening in a matter of like 5 seconds, And occasionally, he'll get no, don't cut here, cut here. And he has had a success rate that is phenomenal in very critical surgeries. Well, once a year, he will invite his patients that he operated on to come to his home and have a little party. They're all celebrating. They're just happy they're alive, And he saved their life. Basically, I mean, you and I, we'd say the Lord did it through him, but their thinking is this guy saved their lives. And he has them into their home, and, they talk and they fellowship and they share. And before the evening is done, this is so cool. This is to show you God can use any occupation. He wants to use all our occupations for His glory. Before that little party is over, the doctor will stand up and say something like this. He'll say, well, I know you think I saved your life because I performed this life-saving operation, but I want to tell you how somebody named Jesus can save your life forever. And he'll just share that. And don't you think they listen? He's already saved their life once. I mean, they're going to listen. He has earned the right to speak into the lives of people. Sometimes we try to speak to people about the Lord and we haven't earned the right to be heard. Unfortunately, I guess, most of the time in today's world, we have to earn the right to be heard first. And the way you earn the right is to live the life. St. Francis of Assisi said this, and we'll get into this more when we talk about evangelism. He said, always preach the gospel, and if necessary, use words. Meaning that most of the time, especially Monday through Friday when you're at your job, you'll get in trouble if you preach the gospel the way a pastor preaches a sermon on Sunday morning. We're not called to preach the gospel that way, but we're called to be living epistles that live the life before people that shows them that their life can be different. So as I said, Scripture does not use the term part-time. I just despise that term, because what that does is that devalues a person's life. Well, a pastor is full-time. A missionary is full-time. Well, if you're a farmer, you're full-time. If you're whatever, you're full-time. Let's look at the ultimate example of Jesus, and of course he is our ultimate example. Luke chapter 2, verse 52 is an amazing verse. Have you ever noticed there's lots of amazing verses in the Bible? There certainly are. And some of them you read 200 times, and then all of a sudden one day you understand what it means, and you go, wow, why didn't I see that before? I don't think I'm the only person that happens to. Luke chapter 2 and verse 52 is a major verse. Here's one reason why. This verse covers 18 years of his life. The previous verse, he's 12 years old. This is the story of when he got separated from his parents and they're looking for him for 3 days and they can't find him and all that. He's 12 years old. And then the next verse, chapter 3, verse 1, he's 30 years old. So this one verse is the only verse that gives us any understanding of what Jesus did from the time he was 12 to the time he was 30 years old. And it says this: Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and favor with God and man. Jesus grew, he grew physically, but he grew spiritually also, in wisdom and stature and favor with God and with man. What do we know about the life of Jesus when he was growing up? Well, he was the oldest son, obviously. He had several brothers and sisters, and probably historians tell us that Joseph died when he was in his mid-teens. Let's say he's 15 years old, something like that. Well, he's the eldest child, so it becomes his responsibility not only for himself, not only for his mother Mary, but for his many siblings that he had. How did he spend most of his life those years? He was a carpenter. And if you look at the Greek word that explains what Jesus did, it means he was a craftsman. He was a craftsman. Jesus, our ultimate example, spent 3 years teaching, preaching, and healing, as we read about in the Gospels, but he spent maybe not 18 years, but let's say he began when he was 15. That would be 15 years of his life working as a craftsman. Now, I used to think when you talked about Jesus being a carpenter, he had this little bitty shop, and he had a couple tools, and he worked by himself building nice little pieces of furniture that people would buy. There again, the idea given is that he had a good-sized business. He perhaps had numerous employees working for him, and out of this business, he was able to support himself, Mary, and all of his siblings. Don't you think Jesus had some of the same experiences at work that you and I have? You think Jesus ever dealt with dishonest people? Sure he did. Somebody'd take a chair he made, take it home, it'd fall off the car, get a big scratch on it. They'd come back and say, look at this piece of furniture you sold me, it's got a big scratch on it. They're lying. Well, just like you and I experienced some of those situations at work. He dealt with people who were dishonest. He dealt with people that were unhappy. He dealt with the same problems you and I deal with at our jobs. And just maybe the things he learned at his job helped him later on when he spent 3 years in public ministry. They sure didn't hurt, that's for sure. Consider this. When Jesus chose 12 men, 11 if you don't count Judas, to turn his earthly ministry over to, who did he choose? Did he choose the religious leaders of the day? No, he didn't choose them. He chose men that were fishermen, doctors. Matthew was a tax collector, people that worked ordinary jobs. At one time, Jesus gave an award to someone for having the greatest faith he had ever seen. Let's look at that account. It's found in Matthew chapter 8, if you would turn over there. Matthew chapter 8. Consider this. Jesus is going to give an award for having the greatest faith. Can you imagine how special that would be if Jesus came up to you and he said, Radu, I'm going to give you an award because you have the greatest faith I've ever seen. You'd think that was so wonderful and so special. Well, Jesus gave an award for having great faith, but he did not give it to one of his apostles, one of his disciples who lived with him, ministered and worked with him. Can you imagine Peter thinking, I'm certainly going to get this award, because that's just the way Peter was. Thomas, on the other hand, doubting Thomas, said, well, there's no way I'm going to get it, and he was right. But it had to go to one of the 12 disciples, right? Let's read the story. Matthew chapter 8, verse 5. When Jesus entered Capernaum, a centurion, an officer in the Roman army. Question, was the Roman army Christian? No way, no how. As we like to say, no way, Jose. When Jesus had entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him, asking for help. Lord, he said, my servant lies at home paralyzed, suffering terribly. Jesus said to him, shall I come and heal him? The centurion replied, Lord, I do not deserve to have you come under my roof, but just say the word, and my servant will be healed. Verse 9, for I am a man under authority with soldiers under me. I tell this one, go, and he goes, and that one, come, and he comes. I say to my servant, do this, and he does it. When Jesus heard this, he was amazed and said to those following him, now look it carefully, truly I tell you, I have not found anyone in Israel with such great faith. Jesus did not find anyone in Israel with such great faith as the Roman centurion who worked for the heathen Roman government. Now, what did that man do? I mean, here's the disciples. They had all the DVDs. They'd been to all the seminars. They had Jesus app on their cell phone. I mean, anytime they wanted to, they could find out what was current and what was taking place with Jesus. Well, they would have. But they didn't get it. What did this centurion get? What did he understand that they didn't? Well, there's numerous things you could consider here, but I think the main one is this. The Roman army officer made a connection between Christianity and his job. He said to himself, well, wait a minute. I have a dear servant who's sick. Well, I work for a boss, the Roman Empire, and they tell me to do something and I do it. And I have soldiers who work for me and I tell them to do something and they do it. Yeah! And then, the illumination came to his thinking. And he said, oh, maybe the kingdom of God is like this. God has authority over Jesus. And if Jesus does what God wants, which he always did, and says to sickness, be gone, sickness has to obey Jesus, just like my officer has to obey me. And somehow he made this connection that it was just like it was in the Roman army, and Jesus told him he had the greatest faith of anyone he'd ever seen. We're going to start with this verse, 1 Thessalonians Chapter 4, verse 11, actually a couple verses, 1 Thessalonians Chapter 4, verse 11 and 12. We'll read this and then we'll pick up talking about it in the next session here. 1 Thessalonians Chapter 4. Paul is writing, and I just love this because Paul was a deeply spiritual man. In fact, one time he had a vision, he had an experience, and he said, I don't know if I was in my body or I don't know if I was out of my body, but I went to the third heaven. You know what people do today? That they'd write a book. They'd be on TV. They'd be telling that story every way. Their out-of-body experience. So Paul had some very deep spiritual experiences. But he's writing to a group of people that expect that Jesus is going to come back any time, quickly. And he tells them to love one another, but then he goes on to say something very practical after this. 1 Thessalonians Chapter 4, verse 11 and 12. Make it your ambition. Everybody say ambition. Make it your ambition to lead a quiet life, to mind your own business, and to work with your hands as we told you. Meaning he had said this at least one other time, if not multiple times. Paul, the deeply spiritual person, told that congregation at Thessalonica, make it your ambition to work with your hands.